Okay, so you're ready for a deep dive. Right here, right now. And today, we're tackling something pretty fundamental, something we all deal with. How to get a grip on this thing we call our mind.
And to navigate that, we're going to be using this really interesting ebook by Sandeep Maheshwari called How to Control Your Mind.
It's a big question, isn't it? I mean, who hasn't wished they had a bit more control over their own thoughts?
Well, that's what we're going to be exploring in this deep dive, really trying to unpack Maheshwari's ideas. And not just like what he says on the surface, but like the deeper implications for understanding our thoughts and ultimately, how those thoughts shape our actions day in and day out.
Yeah, exactly. It's about moving beyond just theory and into practical application.
Yeah.
And one of the core concepts Maheshwari presents is this distinction between the mind and the intellect. This idea that we can develop our intellect to be more like the captain of the ship, instead of constantly being tossed around by the waves of our mind, so to speak.
And one of the things that kind of jumps out at you right from the start, right, is this tension that he highlights. The fact that so often we know what the right thing to do is, the smart choice, but we still find ourselves going in the opposite direction. We feel that fear, that unproductive fear creeping in, even when we know logically there's no real danger. Or we struggle to build those good habits, the ones we know would make our lives better, but just can't seem to stick with them.
It's like we're constantly battling ourselves. So to even start unpacking that, let's begin with the basics.
Yeah.
The mind itself. How does Maheshwari describe this force that seems to have so much sway over us?
So at its very core, he suggests, the mind is kind of operating on this really basic principle. Seek pleasure and avoid pain. Immediate gratification, it's all about that now feeling, and it's often like remarkably unconcerned with the longer term consequences of those immediate choices.
So it's like that ultimate live for the moment kind of machine,
Yeah.
even if that moment isn't really serving us well in the grand scheme of things.
Right, yeah. And he also makes this point that the mind functions based on like our instincts and all these ingrained patterns we've developed over time. It's not inherently good or bad in itself. It doesn't have this built-in moral compass. It's just reacting based on our past experiences and this, pretty primal drive toward pleasure and away from pain, like think about those automatic reactions you have, those habits you just fall into without even thinking about it. That's your mind doing its thing.
That makes perfect sense. Those autopilot moments, we all have them. But so then where does the intellect come into all of this? How does it help us navigate this very pleasure-driven, immediate gratification-seeking mind that we're all walking around with?
So the intellect is presented as this tool that we can develop, that we can use to actually guide the mind, to be in charge. And the key idea here is that when we truly understand something, right, like at a deep intellectual level, when we have that aha moment, that genuine realization, that's what gives us the power to break free from those negative patterns that the mind tends to get stuck in. It's not just about like knowing about something, superficially. It's about deeply understanding it, getting to the core of it.
Right, that light bulb moment.
Yeah.
But I think many of us have had this experience where we get that flash of insight, we feel motivated, and then it just fades. Like, how does Maheshwari address that?
Yeah, he does. He does. And he uses this really like vivid analogy. He says life is kind of like a flowing river. And we might try to like draw lines in that river, hear some advice, get a little burst of motivation, but the water keeps moving.
Right.
And those lines they disappear. Just hearing something, it's not enough to really change the flow.
So just the initial understanding isn't enough.
It's a start, but he goes on with the river analogy, you see, and he talks about these rocks on the riverbed. And these rocks, he suggests, represent like our deep-seated thought patterns, those things that are really hard to change. So when the water, of our everyday life flows over these uneven patterns, it creates all these waves, and those waves are like that mental restlessness, those inner conflicts that we feel. So to really change the flow of the river, to find a calmer, more peaceful state, we need to address those underlying rocks, those thought patterns, through practice, through constant effort. It's like reshaping the riverbed, not just trying to smooth out the surface.
That makes a lot of sense. It's going deeper, addressing the root cause, not just the symptoms. So how do we actually go about strengthening this intellect? It sounds like something that requires real effort, real commitment.
Exactly. It's not a passive process. Maheshwari suggests that consciously choosing the path that we know is right Even when our mind is pulling us in another more tempting direction, that's how we strengthen the intellect over time. Every time we make that deliberate, reasoned choice, it's like we're telling the intellect, hey, I'm listening to you, you're the one in charge here. It's like working out a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
And he also mentioned something that I found really interesting: useless conversations. How do those actually weaken our intellect?
So his idea is that getting drawn into pointless conversations, these unproductive exchanges, it triggers this like flood of scattered thoughts in our minds. Like just think about it. Rehashing the same arguments over and over again, gossiping, it consumes our mental energy without leading to any real understanding or growth. It's just mental clutter. And that clutter actually drains our intellectual resources. It makes it harder to think clearly and rationally. And by default, it gives more power to that impulsive, pleasure-seeking mind. It's like having, too many apps running on your phone. It slows everything down.
Makes it harder to focus on what's important. I love that analogy of the mental clutter. And then he uses the example of drinking to really contrast this impulsive mind with the more reasoned intellect.
Yeah, that's a good one. So, the mind might be saying, hey, let's have another drink. This feels good. Let's let loose, and that can lead to those impulsive actions, maybe reckless behavior. But the intellect, on the other hand, is offering different perspective, maybe a more reasoned approach. Hey, a drink or two in moderation, that's fine, but, driving under the influence, that has serious consequences. So it's the intellect that can see beyond that immediate urge and consider the bigger picture, the potential outcomes.
So the first step in all of this, in strengthening the intellect, is to consciously start planting those correct thoughts. But where do these correct thoughts come from? How do we even know what those are?
So Maheshwari suggests that often, that deeper wisdom, the understanding of what's truly right for us, it's already there inside us. The challenge is that our mind can be so easily distracted, right? Seduced by that promise of instant gratification, those powerful instincts. And in those moments, we tend to ignore that quieter, more reasoned voice of the intellect. It's like having this wise advisor inside you, but you're not really paying attention to what they're saying.
It's that constant battle between like what we know logically and what we're feeling pulled towards in the heat of the moment.
Exactly. But he offers a really encouraging thought here. He says the satisfaction, that genuine joy we feel from gradually overcoming our weaknesses, from those small incremental improvements, it's much deeper and more lasting than the fleeting pleasure we get from just giving in to the mind's immediate desires. It's the feeling of becoming the master of your own actions, not just being driven by impulses.
Yeah, there's a real sense of accomplishment that comes with like breaking a bad habit or achieving a goal that we set for ourselves.
And he highlights how the mind can get caught in this cycle where it kind of gets used to or desensitized to smaller pleasures and starts seeking out increasingly negative habits just to get that same jolt, that same level of gratification. It's like almost like a treadmill, right? You just have to keep running faster and faster to get the same effect.
Always needing a bigger and bigger fix to feel something.
Exactly. So the way to counter this, he suggests, is to actually find pleasure in doing what's right. He uses the example of speaking truthfully, even when it's tough, or when you know it might not be popular. There's this inherent reward in living in alignment with your values. It feels good to do the right thing, even when it's hard.
That definitely resonates. There's a certain integrity in speaking your truth, even if it's uncomfortable sometimes. But he also acknowledges that being truthful can sometimes lead to, negative reactions from others. How do we navigate that?
He does. And this is where the wisdom of the intellect becomes really important. It's not about just being blunt or confrontational for the sake of it. The intellect helps us discern, right? Like when it's truly important to stand up and speak our truth, and equally important when silence is actually the stronger, more effective response. He gives this example of challenging like a corrupt official in front of all their supporters. Sometimes in that context, saying nothing is actually a more powerful statement. It's about picking your battles, choosing your moments wisely.
So we're building this understanding that the mind is this powerful force driven by immediate desires, but that the intellect, even though it might be quieter, has the potential to be even more powerful in the long run. It's like the tortoise and the hare.
Exactly. And he really emphasizes that, as strong as the mind's impulses can feel, our capacity for intellectual understanding, for reasoning, is actually even greater. If we can really grasp something at that deep, fundamental level, we can actually shift the direction of our thoughts, and our actions will follow.
And he uses that example of how we react differently to, say, our mother and a romantic partner to really illustrate this power of the intellect.
Right. It's brilliant. Like, On a purely physical level, the mind might just see two people, right? But it's the intellect that defines those relationships, that understands the depth of that bond with our mother, the unique connection with a partner. And that's why our emotional responses are so different in those two situations. It's the intellect providing the context, the framework. And a lot of this comes from those deep-seated cultural values, the respect and love for mothers that's so strong in many Eastern cultures, for example. These values get ingrained in our intellect over time. And that makes it much less likely for the mind to question or contradict those understandings.
It's like the intellect is setting the rules of the game, and then the mind is playing within those rules.
Exactly. And he also talks about how the clarity that the intellect brings to those important commitments, like marriage, for example, helps to keep the mind from being swayed by those fleeting attractions or impulses. It's like this anchor, right? That intellectual understanding of the depth of the commitment, of the promises we've made, it helps to ground us when the mind starts to wander.
So when we make decisions based purely on what feels good in the moment, on the mind's impulses alone, we're potentially setting ourselves up for trouble down the road. Is that what he's saying?
Absolutely. He gives the example of being attracted to someone outside of a committed relationship. The mind might be drawn to the excitement, that novelty, but the intellect is recognizing the bigger picture, the potential pain and disruption that could cause, not just for yourself, but for others. It's about thinking long term.
And this really leads to a key point that Maheshwari makes, that trying to directly suppress thoughts, to just tell yourself, don't think about that, often backfires, right?
Yeah, it does. And it's so counterintuitive, isn't it? But he's right. He uses the example of trying not to be attracted to someone. The more you try to push that thought away, the more it tends to pop up, almost like it's mocking you.
So if we're not supposed to try to directly stop these thoughts, where should we be focusing our energy? What's the alternative?
The key, he says, is to focus on cultivating wisdom, on bringing that intellectual understanding, that deeper perspective to those impulses. When your mind starts to wander or get fixated on something, the solution isn't to try and force it to stop, but rather it's about engaging your understanding, your reason. Okay, why am I drawn to this? Is this really what I want? What are the likely outcomes of acting on this impulse? It's about bringing that logical lens to those emotional urges.
That makes a lot of sense. Understanding those underlying desires rather than just trying to shut them down completely. Yeah. So what about that very common struggle, the one we all face, of forming new positive habits? We all know how challenging that can be.
He's very practical about it, which I really appreciate. He uses the example of trying to eat a healthier diet, which, pretty much everyone can relate to at some point. And he advises against those really drastic sudden changes because that often just triggers resistance from the mind. You white knuckle it for a few days and then you just give up.
It's the difference between that extreme diet that lasts a week and the gradual, more sustainable changes.
Exactly. And again, this is where the intellect comes in. It's about using your understanding to inform those changes. So instead of just deciding to eat more fruit, right? The intellect might guide you to understand that, okay, maybe the best time to eat fruit, to actually get the most benefit from it, is in the morning. So it's not just changing your behavior, it's understanding the why behind it. And that makes it much more likely to stick.
So it's understanding the why, not just the what. And then there's this idea that Maheshwari brings up about this gap between what we think is right and what actually is right. How do we start to close that gap?
The main way to bridge that gap, he suggests, is through this ongoing process of sharpening our understanding, actively seeking out knowledge, gaining new insights. But he also cautions against wasting our intellectual energy on those unproductive debates. The ones that don't really lead to any personal growth or understanding. Those endless arguments, maybe about politics, that just get us riled up but don't really change anything. That's often just the mind getting caught up in all the external noise.
So being mindful of where we direct our mental energy, focusing on the things that actually contribute to our growth and understanding.
Exactly. He advocates for this balanced approach, right? Avoiding extreme viewpoints and always being aware of the, kind of clever ways that our own minds can try to trick us. Once we start to recognize those patterns, the intellect can step in and offer a more objective perspective.
It sounds like this ongoing process of self-reflection and intellectual growth. But what are the things that actually cultivate the intellect? How do we nourish it, so to speak?
Yeah. Maheshwari points out that the mind, it kind of thrives on pleasurable experiences.
Right.
And that can lead to this never-ending cycle of craving, maybe even those addictive behaviors. But the intellect, it's different. It's nourished by facts, knowledge, logical reasoning. He even specifically mentions that his own talks and sessions, they're designed to engage the intellect, not just to entertain the mind.
So it's like actively seeking out information, understanding, engaging in thoughtful discussions.
Yeah.
That's the fuel for the intellect.
Right. And he really emphasizes the importance of being fully present and aware in whatever you're doing. He uses this, really powerful image of the world as this like huge marketplace constantly bombarding us with messages designed to trigger that pleasure-seeking part of us. And the mind, if it's left unchecked, it just chases after those things without considering, any of the potential consequences.
So the intellect is that critical thinking part of us, the one that can step back and evaluate those immediate urges.
Yeah, and make a more informed decision. He even refers to the intellect as our, quote, only savior in this whole process. And it's something that's strengthened through accurate knowledge, in-depth information, and a clear understanding of, the difference between right and wrong. Consistently engaging with and applying that right knowledge, that's what empowers the intellect to take control and guide us towards, a better life.
Okay, so now we understand this crucial role of the intellect. But then Maheshwari dives into what he sees as the three main weaknesses of the mind, the vulnerabilities that we can learn to overcome. Let's start with that first one, overexcitement. What's that all about?
So this is about the mind's tendency to kind of lose control when something really good happens, something we've been hoping for, longing for. In those moments of intense joy or excitement, the mind can kind of take over, and that can lead us to make impulsive decisions, actions that we might regret later on. So the key here is to cultivate the sense of composure, of balance, even when things are going really well. Enjoying those positive experiences, absolutely, but not letting that excitement completely sweep us away and cloud our judgment.
Staying grounded, even in the midst of all the good stuff. And the second weakness he identifies is how we react to adverse situations, those difficult or unpleasant experiences that we all inevitably face.
Right. When something unpleasant happens, it's easy to let that disrupt our inner peace, right? We react with anger, frustration, maybe even despair. But Maheshwari offers this alternative, this different approach. He suggests observing the situation calmly without immediately jumping to a reaction, and then choosing a response, if one is even necessary, after we've taken a pause. He actually makes a distinction between genuine anger, which might sometimes be a valid response, and simply acting out of anger, which is often driven by the mind.
It's about creating that space between what happens and how we choose to respond. And then he shares that really insightful story from his own life about his experience at the dentist to further illustrate this point.
Yeah, that's a powerful story. So his anecdote about having a dental procedure, it highlights this power of observing pain, as just a pure sensation, rather than getting caught up in the label of pain and all the fear and resistance that we associate with it. He points out how fear can often precede the actual physical sensation, and how pain itself can actually be a valuable signal from the body, something that's telling us that something needs attention. And he also differentiates between the mind's suffering, like anxiety, stress, depression, that kind of mental and emotional pain, and the body's physical pain, right? And he notes that while both can be indicators that something needs to be addressed, that suffering, that mental and emotional pain, is often the result of how we're interpreting reality, not necessarily reality itself. It's an illusion created by the uncontrolled mind.
It's a powerful shift in perspective. Seeing pain as information, not just something to be feared and avoided. And the third weakness of the mind that Maheshwari describes is what happens in that neutral state, which he points out is actually where we spend most of our time.
Right, it's not always these big highs and lows. And he emphasizes the importance of actually finding joy and contentment in this neutral state, when we're not experiencing those intense emotions. He suggests it's a way to actually reduce our overall stress, which is often fueled by constantly chasing after, more and more, wanting things that we don't actually need. It's about finding peace in the everyday, in the absence of constant stimulation.
Finding peace in the ordinary moments.
Right.
And this is where he introduces that concept of the sound of silence.
Exactly. So the sound of silence is something that you can experience in that calm, neutral state. And Maheshwari connects it to this deep sense of inner peace and contentment, what he calls the highest level of existence. He acknowledges that, at first being still and quiet, it can feel like boredom. Our minds are so used to, seeking out stimulation, wanting to be entertained or distracted. But he suggests that beyond all that, beyond the constant seeking of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, that's where we find our true self, that core consciousness. And that's where the sound of silence resides.
Like this hum that's always there beneath the surface of everything else. And he really encourages us to pay attention to it, to really understand its significance, to see the difference between what is temporary and what is truly lasting.
He describes it as this, really fundamental thing, like a radio, that's playing a constant frequency without any external wires, this continuous presence that's unlike all the fleeting sounds of the world. And for him, it's this state of like profound being that he wouldn't trade for anything, not for material wealth, not for fleeting pleasure. And then he challenges us to think about it. Like, would we be so quick to trade that inner stillness for something temporary? It's about recognizing the true value of that silence, the lasting peace it offers.
And that understanding of what's permanent, that then ties into his definition of true love, doesn't it?
It does. He defines true love not as, that intense emotional roller coaster ride, but as this deep, unshakable connection with what is permanent, with what doesn't change. And realizing this, he says, is what truly liberates us from suffering. Understanding this, it makes you a king, regardless of your external circumstances. But lacking this understanding, he says, even an emperor can feel like a beggar, constantly chasing those fleeting satisfactions.
And this naturally leads to the question of the self and this idea of the sound of silence as something divine. Is it God? And if we are that sound of silence, are we in some way also divine? It's a pretty profound question.
It is. And to explain this, Maheshwari uses the analogy of an actor playing a role on stage. So the actor, that's our true self, the sound of silence, is separate from the temporary character they're playing. The physical body, the thoughts, the emotions of that role. If we identify solely with that role, with that temporary character, then we experience all the ups and downs, all the drama that goes with it. But understanding ourselves as the actor, it allows for this detachment. It allows us to fully inhabit the role, but also to step out of it when it's time.
So we're like the canvas, and our lives, our experiences, those are like the paintings on that canvas.
Precisely. And he also brings back that analogy of the waves on the ocean. We perceive ourselves as these individual temporary waves, but fundamentally we're all part of the same constant water. And that water, that's the sound of silence. And then to answer that question directly, about whether we are God, he says, obviously, look, this is an excellent question. If you have the courage to listen to the answer, then here we go. If you weren't God, then there would not have been any problem.
That's a pretty bold statement. What's the logic behind that?
So his reasoning is, if God were this separate being, something outside of us, then why would he allow suffering to exist, right? The real issue, he's suggesting, is that we are that infinite potential, that divine spark. But we've mistakenly identified with our limited, temporary selves, with the body and the mind. It's about recognizing our true nature. And until we do, that infinite potential is, kind of acting through these finite instruments, which results in those limitations. The problem isn't that we're insignificant, it's that we've forgotten our inherent infinity.
And what about those practices, like visiting temples, engaging in rituals? Where do those fit into this?
He suggests that often, people engage in those practices with the hope of fulfilling specific desires, not necessarily from this, deep experiential understanding of their true nature. It's about, wanting something, asking for something. And true devotion, he suggests, it transcends those specific locations or rituals. It's something deeper. And the real key to overcoming the challenges of the mind, he reiterates, it's about sharpening our intellect through living wisely, in the world.
And then he offers this interesting prediction, about a potential point that many of us might reach in our lives, even if we achieve a lot of external success.
Yeah. He anticipates that even after we accomplish those goals, those things we thought would bring us happiness, we might eventually experience this, like, emptiness, this great vacuum. And it's at that point, when we have all the things we thought we wanted but still feel unfulfilled, that the really important questions start to come up. Who am I? What's the point of all of this? What am I really seeking? And asking those questions, truly searching for those answers, that's the beginning of real understanding. That's the path to true liberation, he suggests.
So to bring this deep dive into how to control your mind to a close, it seems like the core message is about recognizing the crucial difference between that reactive, pleasure-seeking mind and the more reasoning, wisdom-holding intellect.
Yes, absolutely. And the path to greater control, to inner peace, lies in cultivating and strengthening that intellect, through knowledge, understanding, and conscious choices, allowing it to guide the mind toward a more fulfilling, less reactive way of being in the world.
And for you, our listener, I think the key takeaway here is the mind, it seeks immediate pleasure, avoids pain. It often doesn't think about the long-term consequences. The intellect, it offers that long-term perspective. It gives us the ability to understand and manage those often impulsive desires. And ultimately, controlling your mind isn't about suppressing thoughts. It's about this gradual process of, intellectual development and self-awareness. It's a journey.
So now that you've been on this deep dive with us, what does the sound of silence mean to you? How might a deeper understanding of that change the way you navigate your thoughts, your experiences moving forward?
It's a question worth pondering, something to explore on your own.